This is a book about reputation, social embeddedness, and organizational change. Before I start presenting this book that's written by Critic and his students and also myself and some of our colleagues, I just have some kind of personal start, and that is because as we all talk about, Stanford is excellent and everyone here is excellent. So I just tell you that I started my course this semester, my last master course. I started, and this is in institutional theory, and I said to them, you must look at your studies here in a more collective institutional perspective. We have invested a lot in your education, and you must give back to the society when you are starting working. And nobody in the audience said to me, no, you're wrong, Professor Tom. We're here because University of Oslo is excellent, and you are celebrating individual achievement, and everyone here is so excellent. So that's why we are here. And we're only thinking about our own career. No one said that. And so that's some kind of cultural background. And in this book, we have a sweet little story about University of Oslo. University of Oslo, which is the best university, we think. University of Oslo, they asked the other universities, is it okay that we say we are the best university in Norway? But for the others, it was not okay. So what did I end up with? Now on the website, it says, the University of Oslo, a leading European university. So they lifted the confusion up to a higher level, and they avoided then the confrontation in an egalitarian society. All right, the book is about what is typical for reputation management of the universities as reflected by their websites. So this is mostly a study driven by data from websites. So what are the core symbols? The other part is about social embeddedness and how social embeddedness is reflected in the institutionalization of diverse organizational features. And there are three such organizational changes: development offices, diversity, and legal unit. And this second part of the book is about American universities, while the first part of the book about reputation management is about Norwegian, Chinese, and American universities. And then, of course, what's the explanation of the diversity between the universities and the change of organizational units? Oops, it's... So what is reputation and reputation management? And this is a type of theory that's now pretty dominant in certain circles, at least in my field, public administration. So reputation is a set of beliefs about an organization's capacity, intentions, history, and mission that's embedded in a network of multiple audiences. So one of the main reasoning here is that if we are successful in reputation and reputation management, the systematic use of that instrument, then we will get a lot of extra slack, we will get a lot of extra goodwill and support. The basis for the study about reputation management is actually using three of the four reputation categories of Carpenter. And that's, first of all, performative, moral, and technical or professional, while the procedural part we don't really use much. So this is some kind of way we are organizing the study. Oops, it's not working. It should be working. Where is Jens? Sorry about that.
Now it should work. Try it now.
All right, now it should work. There it is. All right. Sorry about that. The social embeddedness, you all know that type of literature. And the reasoning here is that universities have become socially embedded and they are more closely linked and responsive towards multiple constituencies. They face, for example, global, national, and regional pressure to become organizational actors with certain new standardized features. This will result in isomorphism, in convergence. But on the other hand, of course, we have also things that could point in the other direction, in a more divergent direction. For example, historical factors, path dependencies, type of task, type of links one have, for example, to the environment. So that's very, very briefly some of the thoughts we started out with. The methods we use, and of course we know quite clearly that web sensors looking at websites, it's not the real world. It's some kind of the social construction of reality. That's the windows of opportunity, or windows you show, window dressing. And we don't really have data on how this message they send out is actually received. So up front we can say that there are obvious limitations of studies like that. But we have, as I said, data from US and Norway and China. The data from US and China are the most similar. They are larger stratified samples of universities, and then you have also a certain group of elite universities. The data from Norway is actually stratified according to different generations of universities. So we have the old university, the more general old university, we have the specialized universities, we have the 68 universities, and we have the even younger ones. And then we have what we call pragmatic categories of internal and external features, like do they look, how do they look, the performance symbols connected to history, to strategy, to research, to teaching, to other internal things, and to external connections. And then the American samples on organization differentiation is taken from integrated post-secondary education data system, and this is a geographically stratified sample, and it's 20% of the universities that's in the sample. So what are very briefly, what are the main results? For the universities in the US concerning reputation, they score overall highest on the professional dimension and lowest on the performative dimension, which, seen from outside, of course, could be a little bit surprising. And I asked Chicky earlier today, what's your explanation of that? And since I guess that we will get a question on it, and he said, I don't really have a good explanation for that. So if you have a better or a good explanation, please come forward with it. What's more understandable is that the elite universities, they use overall all the reputation symbols more. And they score relatively highest on research, but also history and academics / teaching, while the national sample, the non-elite sample, score highest for strategic planning. And maybe one reason for that could be that if you reveal too much of your strategy as an elite university, maybe that's not so good. That's one of the possible explanations. The Nordic universities, they are, and that's very much expected, they are very much into the moral dimension or the moral category. And that means that they are talking a lot about that they are creating a good learning environment, that they are multi-religious, multi-cultural, multi-everything, and they are very much including everything, and everyone should be here. And it's not so much talk about excellence, but it's a lot about talking about all the things you can get socially with being a student, for example. And as you all know, we have quite a wide selection of student services in the Nordic countries. What we see quite clearly is that the specialized universities, like the technical universities, they score overall highest on all the reputation dimensions. And there are many reasons for this. And one reason, of course, is that they have a more clear message. It's more easy to brag about something when you're a specialized university compared to more general universities. Their identity is very clear, and they can more easily use full force behind some of the symbols. For example, many of these technical universities put a lot of emphasis into that they have a national responsibility to educate a certain group, and that group is very large in many countries. For example, civil engineer, computer science, all these things. What we see is that 68 generation universities and the young universities, they don't have much to brag about except in the moral part, and so they overplaying this. They say that University of North in Bodø has one of the best learning environments in the world, blah, blah, blah. So why should they? I don't know, but they don't have so much more to brag about. They don't have a long tradition. They're not any kind of broad university in that respect. So there's some kind of overplaying other parts of their profile. And what we also see, and that's very typical, is that overall there are much more extensive use of symbols in 2015 than in 2005, especially in Norway and Sweden. I would not go so much into that, but there are also, as often it is in the studies of the Nordic countries, that there's a difference between the different types of Nordic countries. Normally, we say it's a East Nordic and a West Nordic, but we see quite clearly in this study that Norway and Sweden, they are similar, and Finland and Denmark are some kind of more muted. They are not bragging so much. So the Swedes and the Norwegians, they are bragging the most. I'm sorry to tell you. The Chinese, it's a little bit embarrassing, but that's okay. Chinese universities, they don't talk about moral issues at all. They don't say that, for example, the university I'm working at, Renmin, they never say, oh, it's so cozy to be at Renmin University, please come here, you know, we can drink and we can party. So what they very much are looking into is the professional and performative dimension, particularly the performative dimension. And what's also interesting with the Chinese universities, very different from the Norwegian or the Nordic and the American ones, is that there's not much variety between the universities. And one of the reasons for that is of course that this is a one-party state. There's an enormous national standardization of the universities. And China is one of the few countries in the world where you actually have official ranking of the universities. So nearly everyone is ranked exactly at a certain place, and of course this is the universities, they are administrative units. So they get resources according to the ranking, and they are very much some kind of performative oriented. So if you are in Renmin, Tsinghua and Beijing University, you get most of the money. And so that's the way they do it. So it's very little difference between the different types of universities. But like in US, teaching and research is very much where you use most of the symbols. When we then move to the main results concerning organizational differentiation and change in US, we see that development offices, for example, containing fundraising things, and among other things, they are there in all American universities. And they are placed very often high in the university hierarchy. There are some resource variety between the larger sample and the elite sample, of course. The two other type of organization units, diversity management and legal offices or officers, they show quite more difference between the elite universities and the sample. Diversity offices, they are much more institutionalized in elite universities, and legal councils, they are more frequently used than legal offices. They're both more frequently used and larger in the elite sample, in the national sample, and more so in the public universities. Maybe that's a little bit of a surprise. But of course, legal things in the US, that's pretty different from Europe, is very important. You can drag university to court for a lot of different things, and you can also use legal help for everything from patenting to other things. But this court or this legal orientation is very different from most of the European universities. So, very briefly summing up, we find using the websites extensive use of reputation symbols, more so for elite universities than the national samples. We find different national profile, US relatively more on the professional side, probably reflecting a very different history of the US university, more locally, more connected to local stakeholders and local markets. Norway, much more moral, reflecting egalitarian values. That's extremely important, not much preoccupied with individualism. And the Chinese, they look into the performative things, and they are much more standardized. And we also find that it's a differentiated use of symbols according to type of activity and what kind of stakeholders you are connecting with. And then the emerging institutionalization of the development, diversity and legal offices, it's very evident, and it's more so for the elite sample. Thank you.
Well, let me first of all take the prerogative of, I think I'm probably the oldest guy in the room, to say a few more general things about ScanCore. And it's clear to me that even loosely coupled networks and very collegial communities exist, but they would not persist without a structure. I'm an organization structure guy. And I think we ought to spend just a few minutes to honor those who have provided structure to this community over 30 damn years. That's a long run. And we correctly celebrated last night the founding director, Jim, who's had an extremely strong and continuing impact on this community by his writing and by who he was and by his modeling of how to be an interesting academic. Most of us thought that Jim could not be followed, that act was a one of a kind, but Woody Powell turned out to have some of the skills and many of the attributes that we were looking for, and he very ably continued that tradition that Jim started. That was passed on then to Mitchell, who carried it on in a Mitchell-like way, providing, I think, all kinds of useful perspective in his leadership skills. And I think bringing in Sarah Sewell as a part of his leadership team was very important. And then now the current director, Shiki. And so I think we really need to acknowledge and recognize the willingness of these people to spend their time, their energy, the kind of organizing skills they have in support of this community. So those people, I think, need to be recognized and held up. In addition to the fact that in addition to this sort of superstructure, there is, as always, there's a deep state. And we have the people who really help the organization run, the Barbara Bucci's and the Annette Eldridges, and now Maud Engstrom, and that, hope, is she there? in that tradition who's made a huge difference in terms of the continuity and the support and the coordination and all these kind of things that we really need. And then, last but not least, there are a set of Scandinavian scholars who have agreed to serve as board members and as sort of guidance counselors for this project. And I think it's fair to say, oh, I'm sorry. Before we get to the board of directors, I forgot to say there's also an East Coast version of Stanford. And Frank Dobbin is now expanding the model to a sister institution called Harvard. And so we now have ScanCore on both coasts. So that's certainly to be acknowledged. And I'm sorry that I overlooked it. Anyway, back to the board of directors. We heard about intermediaries from Mark and others. These people are really intermediaries. They mediate between universities and governments that spend money and provide resources and support. And as Haldort told us, I think it was this morning, I've lost track of days, there is a Nordic model. Turns out the Nordic countries still believe in the value of higher education. And so we are here today because of that commitment on the part of the Norwegian governments. So in short, there's a lot of people and a lot of organizations that really have allowed us to come together in this way, and hopefully will for a few more years. So I think that it's really important that we say that. So thanks to all you, thanks to all of all the people I've named. So please, yeah. Okay, I'm a critic now, and I think Tom has done a good job of summarizing the work. I think it's important to say that while the management of reputation has long been known to be an activity of all self-respecting organizations, that it's come fairly late to universities. It's rather a new kind of process for them to adopt. Let me say that the work that Tom described, the empirical work, is grounded more generally in arguments associated primarily with John Mayer's work and the work of his colleagues, including Cheeky and others that have continued this work, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. As we heard, the main data sites, the data types that are used are, first of all, the information provided on the university websites, and secondly, the data on specialized administrative units and their growth over time. First, the university websites. There are clearly advantages to this. They're public, they're available, they're accessible, and although they are somewhat superficial, I think one of the things that institutional theory has taught us from day one is that symbols are important. How you talk about yourself, how you present yourself, how you present yourself to others, these are important things to take into account. They're not inconsequential. And so web-based pronouncements of who I am and what I do are not, they're words, but the words symbolize something. The disadvantages, of course, are, and Tom acknowledged this, that they may be remote from what universities actually do. They may even be remote from even how top administrators and faculty think about universities, because they are produced by usually specialized units of the organization called PR and promoters and hucksters, I think we used to call them. and so, who knows what connection they have to what anybody at the university, how many of you have looked at your university website and really studied it? Do you know what they say about what you're doing? I don't think we study that as a part of our orientation for new faculty, or not, anyway. So it's out there, but they may not really reflect the main university's activities and programs, and we ought to recognize that. But they're not nothing. The other major indicator are the staffing of specialized staffing units, the administrative departments, development, fundraising, diversity offices, legal staffs. These data are limited. It's not cross-national. They're all from U.S. universities, a sample. They're all cross-sectional, which is too bad, because I thought part of this was about the growth of these programs over time, but it's not. What it shows is that they are pervasive. These, as we well know, these units are large, and that they're pretty well balanced between public and private. It's all types of universities that are engaged in this. But that data are limited in that way. Okay, the larger theoretical argument is that universities are actors, or in the language of the book, they're agencies. This borrows, of course, from the paper that John Meyer wrote with Ron Jefferson way back in 2000 about actors in modern society. And this is about the fact that increasingly broad societal transformation processes that have gone on since the Enlightenment have created a cultural account which enshrines agency in individuals and in collective actors. And that clearly has led to a real transformation in the way in which society is organized and the way in which society operates. People like Cheeky and Georg Kruken point out that this argument of organizations as strategic actors, as independent sort of agents, was slower to be adopted by universities, which were more, quote, traditional institutions in the old-fashioned sense of institution. But it clearly has come. This language, this set of mental templates has clearly diffused quite broadly in universities. So I have no problem with that argument at all. The second argument I have a little bit more trouble with, the embeddedness argument. The authors argue that American universities have been, from the outset, much more embedded than in their society than in other societies. That's because, and they argue that's because they're more open to the influence of a wide variety of actors, more stakeholders, and so on. Now, I don't take exception to this general description of changes in the types of stakeholders in which universities are responsive, but I don't think it's helpful to describe these changes as involving different degrees of social embeddedness. What could be more embedded than a Catholic university embedded in the monastery and in the whole establishment of the Catholic Church in the 17th and 18th century? What could be more embedded than that? What you're talking about is not degree of embeddedness. What you're talking about is what kind of embeddedness, what is the nature of that context, how diverse is it? That's what the language should be about. You know, Cheeky himself says this way back when he was younger, back in 2006. He says this historical shift in the constitution of universities is a movement from institutions authorized by religious and later social class elites to institutions that aspire to be more meritocratic and multicultural institutions. I agree with that. But that's not a difference in degree of embeddedness. I think we have these terms, but we misspecify them, I think. No measures of embeddedness are presented. One is more, one is less. No measures. Okay. So I have trouble with that application of that. Embeddedness is a really important concept. And we really need to recognize that we are all embedded in context. And the question then becomes, what kind of a context are we embedded in? Okay, so I think that argument is somewhat inadequate. The empirical evidence, the main empirical evidence is the analysis of the material on the websites. Let me begin with the positives about this approach. First of all, the work is comparative, and for all our talk about we being a globalized set of scholars and so on, there is really not nearly enough attention to real comparative analysis in which you have data not just on your country, which you may be embedded in Norway or Sweden or Denmark, but data that really allow us to compare the differences between organizations in one type of social context and organizations in another. So I love the fact that this is in comparative. There are data on universities across about 6 different sites, US, China, and the 4 Nordic countries. Secondly, and the work that I've done recently just reminds, work I did with Mike Kirst here at Stanford, reminds me of how diverse higher education is, how many different kinds of colleges and universities there are. And this research recognizes that there are really quite different subpopulations of colleges in every society. And they attempt to sample broadly among those types of colleges. And that's certainly a strength. And Tom has described the kinds of samples. They differ somewhat in each country, but in each case, they're elite and more comprehensive universities. There are public and private. So they're specialized and generalized and so on. So there is diversity. And finally, it is, I think, important that you try to gather the same type of data on each university in every country. And they do, in fact, use the same source of data, that is, the websites. Tom described that they begin their categories by talking about 4 different dimensions: the performative, the moral, the technical, professional, and procedural. And they have categories in which they code how universities score in each of these. But then for the Chinese and US study, the authors subsume these dimensions under a different set. Each category of performative, moral, procedural, and technical professional is subsumed under history, strategic planning, research, academic, internal, and external. Now, I'm a pretty patient guy. This produces lots of data, produces a hell of a lot of tables. And I'm a pretty patient guy, but I must say, I had a very difficult time of learning anything by looking comparatively at the tables. It's really very hard to interpret what these differences were. And the story, I mean, the argument they're trying to make, and I think it's an important argument, is that all universities are alike in some ways and are sort of attempting to be isomorphic, but all universities are also attempting to be somewhat different, somewhat have their own brand. I understand that. But the categories are, I think, so blunt and are very often themselves embedded in somewhat different ways, so that it's very hard to make sense of how, for example, universities in Norway or Sweden or China or the US really vary in terms of, for example, their use of history. Well, do they refer to their history or not? Well, if you say, I'm a university that looks to the future, that is coded as, yes, I pay attention to history. In short, I think the coding is very blunt to try to reveal what are the real indicators that we care about as we think about the way in which schools present themselves. So I like the aim, the aspiration of this project very much, and it did so many things right that I am sorry to say that I think the empirical data just really need to, that whole approach really needs to be rethought and repaired. I think you need much more fine-grained data to show the nuances of how universities present themselves and how we might compare differences across universities and across countries. So in short, the model of this approach is there, and we still have good work to do.